presentation on the relationship between violent video games and human physiology. So it's important to understand the background of this research. Ever since, honestly, the creation of violent video games, violence and video games have almost been synonymous with one another. And there really weren't many violent video games to start out with that could influence children until around 1992. And that seems to be the starting point where many people would associate this with parental worries as well as the worries of the government. Because in 1992, Ed Boon and John Tobias created the game Mortal Kombat, which is known for its graphic depiction of violence, things like ripping people's heads off or ripping their spines out of their backs. And so that started to worry parents. So in 1993, Senator Joe Lieberman of Connecticut and Senator Herb Kohl of Wisconsin held a Senate hearing on violent video games, including about Mortal Kombat, where they tried to figure out, how can we allay parents' fears about how this will influence their children, which led to the creation of the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB. And the ESRB sorts games into different categories, E for everyone, T for teen, E 10 and up, and M for mature. And while it was an effective strategy and still used today to try and determine what video games include graphic depictions of violence and which don't, many adolescents today still play those M for mature and T for teen games that include graphic depictions of violence, and that starts to influence their psyche. And so video games have been associated with the playing, and violence has been associated with the playing of those video games that are M for mature and T for teen. And often days in many tragic events surrounding adolescents, including fights, violence, and school shootings, video games seems to be a common problem that's associated with those behaviors. And so people want to figure out what's going on. And for me personally, I notice that sometimes I can be very aggressive when playing these kinds of games, so I also wondered how this would affect my peers. And so what's the problem with this? Well, the problem is that violent events among adolescents are still linked to the playing of video games. In fact, many tragedies surrounding adolescents even today are still linked to some of these violent video games from the past that have created influence on newer ones. And so again, as someone who is an adolescent, I have played these violent video games, and I've seen kind of this effect on myself, so I wanted to figure out how can this affect other people. There's also a good amount of existing research and data that has gone into violent video games and how they affect others. So the primary research question being asked here is what's the relationship between violent video games and human physiology in adolescent males. And as aggression is something that can't be measured, there needs to be some sort of medium to measure the aggression in question, because you can't really measure violence or aggression. And so I will be using heart rate and blood pressure to try and determine the physiological responses on humans, specifically in the sympathetic nervous system and a person's fight or flight response. So here's some important definition of terms. We need to know what heart rate variability is. That's the variation of intervals between heart rates, aka your BPM, and so that's just measured on a simple heart rate monitor. And more importantly is the sympathetic nervous system and the body's fight or flight response. And so the sympathetic nervous system is a pathway of nerves that controls this fight or flight response. And that's what really gets the body going. It spikes our heart rate and our blood pressure, and it kind of puts us in a sense of, are we wanting to flee a situation, or do we fight it and become aggressive and attack it head on? And so that's really where this problem seems to be in adolescents when they play these video games, is when that system activates, they start to go in this aggressive sort of fight mode. And so we want to see how that connection between human physiology can affect that. So now on to the literature review. The first piece of literature will deal with heart rate variability and fight or flight response. And so Sue B. Park and her colleagues in the essay Maladaptive Neurovisceral Interactions in Patients with Internet Gaming Disorder tried to figure out this heart rate variability and how it affects kids. And so they said, quote, additionally, and according to the model of neurovisceral integration, heart rate variability may provide a window into the human emotional regulation or dysregulation through the interactions with the brain. And so basically what they were saying there was that if we can look at heart rate variability, we can figure out how that affects our neural systems and our pathways, and how that really puts us into this fight response when we're playing video games. And so ultimately their conclusion was that heart rate variability does show a direct comparison between violence and the fight or flight response. So the second piece of literature primarily deals with the relationship between general aggression and video games. And again, general aggression is very hard to measure, but Craig Anderson and Brad Bushman in their essay, The Effects of Violent Video Games on Aggressive Behavior against Cognitive arousal and pro-social behavior, tried to determine how these video games can maybe show signs of aggression. And so what they did is something very similar to my experience, where they actually had people play these violent video games, and they looked at what that caused in them, and they said, quote, aggression is behavior intended to harm another individual who is motivated to avoid that harm. It does not affect emotion or aggressive thought, plan, or wish. The definition excludes accidental acts that lead to harm, such as losing control of an auto and accidentally killing a pedestrian, but includes behaviors intended to harm even if the attempt fails, such as when a bullet firing from a gun misses a human target. So this is important because my research specifically as the playing of a first-person shooter, and so when you're playing a first-person shooter, of course you intend to cause harm to the person that you're playing against online as you're trying to shoot them with a gun. So whether you miss or whether you hit your target, you're still going to get some sort of aggressive effect out of that. And they also noticed that those first-person shooter kind of games had a direct correlation with whether or not there was more aggression in the person. And then these last two pieces of literature primarily helped me narrow down my focus on who I wanted to test this on. And so J.S. Lemons and P.M. Valkenburg in the Pathological Gaming on Aggressive Behavior found out that adolescent males were the most susceptible to these violent video games, and that usually tended to cause the most effects on them. And so that helped me narrow down my research, because as someone who goes to an all-boys school and an all-boys high school, that really helped me get a good demographic here that I could just concentrate on. And then finally, Salman Khalil and his colleagues in the impact of playing violent video games among school-going children found out that school-going children who played these violent video games tended to also become more aggressive. And so they were in total support of this idea that adolescents are the ones that become more susceptible to playing violent video games, so that really helped me narrow down my research there. And so for my method, I use a quantitative method because it primarily dealt with charts and graphs, specifically a bar graph, which we'll see later, about comparing the heart rate and blood pressure before and after playing a game, as well as pie charts from my survey, which is the other part of the method. And that survey helped me to gauge what kind of people would participate in my research, how much they play video games, and how long they had played video games for. And so for my actual method, what I did is I had people come into a room in a controlled setting where I made sure that their vitals were at normal rate by resting them for 5 minutes. And then afterwards, I would check their blood pressure and heart rate before playing a violent video game. And then they would play one round of the game mode Team Deathmatch, which is around 15 minutes long, in a video game Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, released in 2022. And then as soon as they were done playing, I would again get the blood pressure reader and I would measure their heart rate and blood pressure. And that way, I could see the comparison of how they played and how their blood pressure was before playing the game and how it was after playing the game. So now on to the results. This is my first figure, and this is the actual comparison of pre and post blood pressure and heart rate before and after playing the game. So the graphs in blue demonstrate the blood pressure and heart rate before playing the game, and the graphs in red demonstrate the blood pressure and heart rate after playing the game. And those numbers were just for labeling the participants. And so a total of 83 people responded to the survey, but 77 responded that they did play video games, so I took that into account on the survey questions later. However, 13 of those 83 people actually participated in my survey. So these are those 13 people. And what I found out from this is I couldn't really get a blood pressure reading on the graph, like it was kind of hard. Heart rate was very easy, that y-axis as you can see, but the blood pressure was really hard to measure throughout a graph. So I primarily focused on the heart rate here. But what the trend shows is that blood pressure and heart rate mostly did rise after playing of video games, although participants 1 and participants 10 had lower heart rate, and participants 7 and participants 12 actually remained at a constant heart rate. So this is my first essential question of the survey, and it's how likely are you to play video games that include violence, and this is from a Likert scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being very likely. 37% of the participants gave a rating of 5, 31% gave a rating of 4, and 22% gave a rating of 3, with the other 9% being a 9 or 2. And then this is my second essential question, so how many days a week do you play video games? And around 54% of respondents said they played video games for around 1 to 2 days per week, with 28% saying 3 to 4, and then the rest with 1 or 2. And then the next question was how many hours per day you play video games. and around 48% of respondents said they only play video games for 1 to 2 hours per day, and then 22% said they play for 3 to 5, and then the rest play at either less than 1 hour or a very slim majority at least 6 hours. So now the discussion, well, let's look at what actually happened here. And so there should be a better understanding of this graph right here. And so what we want to look at is that out of the 9 of the 13 participants that participated actually saw their heart rate increase, except for, again, participants 1 and 10 and 7 and 12 who either went down or stayed the same. And from that trend, we can actually see that, yes, there is a trend that when you play violent video games, your heart rate and blood pressure goes up because, again, that's what happened to that majority right there. And so that does bolster my hypothesis that there would be a direct relationship between violent video games and that human physiology, because as you can see from the readings, the majority of players, again, went up. I included this one as well. I like how you play video games, because if we look at the actual people that did the survey, around 37% indicated that they were very likely to play violent video games, and 31% indicated that they were more likely to play violent video games than non-violent video games. So if we look at the 9 people who see that, we can see that all 9 of those people actually inclined that they were more likely to play violent video games, which could have contributed to that rise in heart rate and blood pressure. Then here are some of the questions from the survey. And one thing I found from my survey is that it actually gave way to a side result that I wasn't expecting. And that was actually video game addiction. And so it turns out that around 4 of the people that participated in my research actually had a video game addiction, which constitutes at least 3 days or more of playing for at least 5 hours or more. So you need at least 15 hours of video game per week to be addicted. And so what we could see was that it was 5 of the 13 people that fit that criteria for an average of 15 hours or more of gaming per week, while the other 8 did not. And those addicted players did respond that they were more likely to play violent video games as well. However, we actually see in that graph before that those addicted players did not really show a trend of being more violent or not, because 2 of those addicted players had a constant heart rate, and so that could open us up to some new things. And in conclusion, was that graph supportive of our hypothesis? Yes, because 9 of the 13 people, which was a majority, showed that their heart rate and blood pressure went up when playing these video games. However, there is a caveat, because only 13 people actually participated, and I believe that that wasn't a good enough sample size if we really want to know, especially when we know that 5 of those players are addicted. That actually opens up a new study that you could do that just measures those addicted players and see if there's really a trend of addiction increasing heart rate and blood pressure versus not, because again, 2 of those addicted players did not show signs of spike. And then additionally, I feel like if we can get more people to participate in this kind of survey and just open it up to all adolescents, not just males, we could really see in the general population whether or not there is that direct comparison between violence and video games and that human physiology, because we're not limiting it to a select group. And if we have a greater sample size of people than just 13 over a controlled setting of at least 2 or 3 weeks, then we can actually see how this affects them, not just in one playing session, but throughout a constant time. That side result again of addiction can also be measured on its own, and that can lead to further research. So we can really see how everything comes together, and whether or not there really is that aggression that stems from playing your violent video games and how that affects our fight or flight responses.